Given how early we are in the primary process and how many delegates have yet to be allocated, it might seem absurd to make a bold claim about what will happen. However, if we think about the dynamics of this race and then we look at all the candidates involved and what they are trying to accomplish, the lane they're running in, their prospects for victory, I think that it is very easy to actually predict how this primary will end. And because the dynamics of this race seem to be set in stone even after just two small state primaries, I will go ahead and make my claim. My argument in this video is this. In the 2020 primary, if you live in a state other than New Hampshire, Iowa, and you have not yet voted, your choices are this. You can either vote for Bernie Sanders or vote for a brokered convention. There is no such thing as a vote for Klobuchar, a vote for Bloomberg, a vote for Pete. There is only a vote for a brokered convention or a vote for Bernie Sanders. Those are your two choices. And by the way, I will also further argue that a vote for a brokered convention is effectively the same as a vote for Mike Bloomberg. So I will explain all of this in the course of this video, and I think that I will be able to convince you that this is in fact the case. And before we go any further into this, I would like to give a shout out to the Andrew Yang campaign. He ran a clean race and a substantive race. And I think that he brought quite a bit to the table in terms of advancing the conversation on the UBI, democracy dollars, and a couple of other things as well. So I have to salute Mr. Yang for sticking with substance, never getting personal or nasty, and not engaging in any kind of fuckery. So thank you, Andrew Yang. And also, I am very sorry for the Andrew Yang supporters. I know a lot of them were first-time voters who were very excited and must have been pretty disappointed. I went through something somewhat similar back in 2004. I was a Howard Dean supporter. I was, freshly 18, so have an idea of how that feels. And then, of course, Bernie 2016 was also a pretty painful experience. So I feel your pain, and I can promise you, though, that everything will be okay in the long run, and other candidates will emerge, and hell, Yang could run again one day. I mean, the guy's still pretty young, so who knows what'll happen in the future. But anyway, we're still talking about the 2020 process and the people who remain in that. Also, Deval Patrick dropped out, and Michael Bennett, Mr. Mackey from Colorado, also dropped out. But who gives a shit? My argument hinges on the idea that Bernie Sanders is the only person in the race right now who has the ability to win either a majority, which would avoid a brokered convention, or a plurality, which would give him an advantage going into one. Possibly it would be a mere contested convention where he could combine his delegates with someone else to win on the first ballot. But I don't see a path for any of the other so-called major contenders to even win the plurality of delegates. First up, Amy Klobuchar. Despite her so-called Klomentum, Klobuchar has no actual path to the nomination. Her centrist field is simply too crowded. Now, she could rise a little bit more in the national polls, and maybe she could amass a decent haul of delegates, but currently she's sitting at a perfect 0% with the black community. The reason for that is that it has come out that she railroaded a black teenager in order to advance her career as a prosecutor and come across as tough on crime. Both the NAACP and BLM have called for her to step down. Not from the Senate, but from the campaign. So, yeah, that's not a good place to be if you're trying to win a Democratic primary. However, one X factor that may give her a puncher's chance at a plurality is if Warren drops out and endorses her relatively soon. Because as I'll argue later, I think that if Warren does endorse anyone, it would probably be Klobuchar rather than Bernie at this point, although it is not impossible that she would endorse Bernie. The other person who is getting a lot of media attention and really being fawned over is the fake winner of Iowa, Peter the Cheater. His main asset is that he has a lot of friends in high places, both in the media and in the consultant class, but he poured the vast majority of his resources into the last two contests, and now he's having to raise money afresh to try to compete in Nevada. And he is pouring super PAC funds into the state. However, because a lot of people there are more blue collar, and also there are a higher number of people of color, I don't think that he has any real shot at finishing first or second. Third is not out of the question, but first or second, I think at this point are a long shot for him. And by the way, in Nevada, you need 15%. In the latest poll, which was somewhat problematic, Pete and Amy are both at 10%. And the reason I say problematic is because it massively oversampled old people, and it was using landlines, so most likely you should adjust the numbers for Pete and Amy down, since they tend to appeal to older voters, especially Pete. Now, the problem for both of them, but especially for Pete, is that if you look at their Super Tuesday and beyond states, Bloomberg decided that both of them were unelectable and that there was no centrist who could defeat Bernie, so he stepped in and decided to buy the race. And when he did so, he clearly intended to win. You don't spend $350 million on ads and a buttload of other money on other stuff unless you are playing to win. So he's not there to help these people, he's there to beat them. Now, say Pete and Amy could possibly work together, yield the nomination to one another, something like that, but Bloomberg is not there to play with them, he's there to win. So this is going to be a major problem. So let's say Bloomberg had not entered the race, or he had only entered it but not poured millions and millions of dollars into it. Well, Pete still cheats in Iowa, gets that big media bump, finishes a close second in New Hampshire, and now he has a real campaign. But as it stands right now, Bloomberg is third nationally and climbing. He'll probably overtake Biden relatively soon. This means that all the things that Pete supposedly accomplished in the first two states mean nothing. Amy's clomentum means nothing because there's no way for her to follow up on it. The centrist lane is too crowded for either of them to break out. Biden is a big enough obstacle, but Bloomberg is an iceberg. Biden has basically conceded Nevada without a fight a week or more in advance because of just how badly he did in Iowa and New Hampshire. And now he is planning to make his last stand in South Carolina, the place where he's had a massive lead the entire race. However, we haven't seen a legitimate poll out of Nevada in a while, and we haven't seen a legitimate poll out of South Carolina in a while. So we don't actually know where he's standing, but based on what he's been doing nationally and how badly he shit the bed in Iowa and New Hampshire, it only stands to reason that things are not looking pretty in either state, but that South Carolina is his better shot. In the latest poll that I mentioned earlier, which was completely unscientific, Biden was still at 18% in Nevada. However, if that poll was anywhere near accurate, there's no way that he would give up on Nevada. I think it's safe to say he knows something that we don't about what is going on in Nevada in terms of his support, and he knows that it is a lost cause. Now, Biden also had a major gaffe recently, which is hardly the first, but it is worth mentioning. He has been calling people lying dog-faced pony soldiers when he disagrees with them. This is apparently something he's done on a few occasions, and according to Matt Taibbi, that is actually a reference to an old movie. It's not just some shit he made up or his grandma used to say or whatever. But people don't understand it because it's a very obscure reference to something that was popular back when he was young. So very few people were alive when whatever movie that was came out. And just like a lot of pop culture references, after a certain amount of time, if it's not one of the true classics, it gets lost. If he were to say something like, "Here's looking at you, kid," or address people as his droobs or something like that, people might know what the hell he's talking about. But this one just seems like an insult, and it also comes across as sexist because he sometimes says it to women. I think he's said it to men too, though, but so he doesn't mean it that way, but obviously it doesn't come across well. The point is that he is damaging himself every time he speaks in public, and that he has a failure to communicate with people. Now, technically, nationally, he's still in second place, but his numbers are going down, whereas Bernie is pulling ahead and gaining more steam, and then Bloomberg is coming in right behind Biden, only a couple points down. A lot of the donors are looking to other people to be their savior, whether those people be Pete or Amy or whoever. Some of them are also supporting Bloomberg. Bloomberg's not taking donations because he's worth $55 billion or 60 or whatever the number is. Party officials are also nervous about Biden. Rumors are circulating that even one of his campaign surrogates, John Kerry, has asked him if he wouldn't rather step down and allow John Kerry to run instead. The party threw in all kinds of extra competitors at the last minute: Steyer, Bloomberg, Deval Patrick, and others, just to try to get somebody who would catch on and take up that centrist lane. The people they wanted to replace Biden originally, the Booker, Kamala Harris, and Gillibrand tier of candidates, that was like the official backup lineup for Biden, all of them fell flat on their faces and were just terrible. So this left Klobuchar and Pete, and neither of them have caught on, or at least they didn't catch on early enough for the party to trust them. And again, with Bloomberg in the race, Biden will have a hell of a time raising money and also trying to make a comeback. Making comebacks in primaries, by the way, if 2012 and 2016 are any indication, is extremely difficult. All the candidates who dropped off after a certain point had a very hard time coming back. Normally, when you fall, you stay fallen. Unless you only take a small dip and it's really early, well before voting has started. Biden's case is that voters of color still support him overwhelmingly, and that most of them have not yet voted, and when they do vote, they will make their voices heard, and Biden will rise to the top. I don't think that he has as much fiber in his turds as he thinks he does, though, because he's not going to float to the top on that basis alone. The thing about voters of color is that they are just like white voters in the sense that they're looking for someone who can actually win the election. They're also looking for someone who can win other demographics, because they understand that just because they personally like this guy does not mean that he is electable. Not to mention, some of them support him because of electability, not because they actually think he's the greatest thing ever. And now that he is falling flat on his face and clearly failing to win over white voters, voters of color are going to start bailing, and bailing hard. We've already seen some of his black support in South Carolina has gone to Tom Steyer, of all people, and in Nevada he's been bleeding Hispanic voters to both Bernie and Steyer. So things are not looking good for Joe. So, yeah, Biden will not be making a comeback, but I also predict that he will stay in longer than he should because he's stubborn, and he will keep that centrist vote divided. This will, of course, further damage the chances of Bloomberg, Amy, or Pete to form any kind of plurality. Elizabeth Warren is the X factor for the scenario that I am painting right now. It's not because she has any chance of winning. I think that that ship has sailed and it's not coming back. She has completely and totally destroyed her own campaign by listening to Hillary Clinton advisors and turning away from substance and toward the kind of identity politics and sort of weak meme bullshit that loses election after election for the Democrats. The meme on the right is the kind of example of things that are coming out of her campaign now, whereas before she was talking about her plans and all the things she wants to do as president, talking about fighting the billionaire class, fighting corruption, Medicare for all. Now she uses weasel words like access to healthcare or affordability, and she focuses on unity, uniting the party, being together. Bland cliches that inspire no one. They get cheap applause from rich people at the debates, and I say rich people because you have to donate about $40 to $50 to the DNC to attend. I guess a lot of people don't know that. I actually looked into going into one of the debates that was held near me, and they said you had to donate $40 to the DNC, and I was going to take my girlfriend with me, so it would have been $80, so I said, no thank you, and also I'm not giving any money to the DNC ever. Anyhow, Warren's brilliant Clinton advisors told her that the way to defeat Bernie for the progressive lane was to basically call him a sexist on national TV. She tried that and she looked terrible doing it, bled a lot of support, and basically gave him the dominant position in the lane. She's still clogging up space. If she were to leave the race, the progressive vote would easily solidify under Bernie, and then he would have a major advantage. So right now, she's an X factor for that reason, but there are others. She lost massively in New Hampshire, and it was devastating. I would say it's more embarrassing than Biden's defeat because Biden was not expected to do super well in New Hampshire. He just needed to do okay. Elizabeth Warren, at one point, as recently as maybe 3 to 4 weeks before the votes were cast, was expected to finish a close second in New Hampshire, maybe even manage to upset Bernie. And then she completely fell flat on her face. And if you look to bring back this point of how she's messaging and why it's not resonating, I suggest you go to her website and look at her merchandise. This tells the tale pretty well. She's the only candidate who has like 8 pages of stuff. So any piece of merchandise you can imagine, she has. And she has multiple versions of it with different slogans and whatever. The first 4 pages, so the most recent stuff, those are full of platitudes like unity and bring the party together and girl power, rah rah. You have to go back deep into her catalog to find things like she has a plan for that, or Medicare for all, fight the billionaire class, whatever it might be. So she has turned completely away from substance and toward platitudes, and it is absolutely devastating for her. In order to pull off the platitudes and make them sound good, you have to be appealing to centrist as a centrist, and you also have to have sort of the conventional charisma and charm. Warren has some charisma and charm, but she is very much a nerd. And if you're a nerd, people expect you to be substantive. She doesn't understand that about herself. I don't know what it is, but a lot of these politicians do not have realistic appreciations of who they are. Warren is someone who can do substance, and when you can do substance, almost certainly you're too nerdy not to avoid it. Because if you do avoid it, you're trying to do a coolness contest, and Warren's not winning that. She's not winning that any more than she's winning a credibility contest with Bernie Sanders over what was said in a private conversation that no one actually gives a shit about. So, here's the thing. The main thing that Warren could do to shake up the race at this point, because clearly she's not going to be taking home many delegates, most likely, and she has no real shot. If she stays in the race, she does detract from Bernie's vote total some, but she also detracts from Klobuchar's because she is playing the woman card really heavily. And a lot of the voters who are in both Warren's camp and Klobuchar's camp prioritize putting a woman in the White House above anything that can remotely resemble substance. If she drops out, her endorsement could carry a lot of weight with it. And she is pretty likely to drop out before Super Tuesday because her path is becoming increasingly grim. So if she shits the bed in Nevada, it's pretty much over. And also, by the way, she polled 13% in that recent poll. And that was only a little bit above Pete and Amy, but you have to hit at least 15 to get anything from Nevada, so she's in danger of not getting anything once again. If she endorses Bernie or Klobuchar early while she still has some credibility and some pull, that could be pretty big, especially if she did it right before Super Tuesday. That could make a big difference, and that could either give Bernie the majority that he needs to win, or it could deprive him of the majority and keep him at a plurality. It could also give Klobuchar her like 1 or 2% chance of getting the plurality of votes. As time passes, however, Warren is losing her clout and people are less interested in what she has to say. So if she's going to make a power play, she would have to do it early, but I think that she still believes she has a path, and a lot of her ardent supporters will stick with her to the end, even as the Titanic is going straight down. So this is the X factor. This is the one thing I cannot account for at all. So keep that in mind. This is the thing to watch, what Warren does. If Mike Bloomberg were not in this race, I think that we would not be having a serious conversation about a brokered convention. It would, of course, be possible, but it would be extraordinarily unlikely. Sure, the field could be crowded enough to deprive anyone of a clear majority, but all the candidates running would be people with finite resources who would continue to rely upon momentum and donations from people so they could keep going, which means that they would have an incentive to drop out. For Mike Bloomberg, no such incentive exists. And this is someone with a massive ego. Bloomberg also is clearly not playing just to stop Bernie Sanders. He wants to be president. This is clearly something that he has set his sights on, and he will not relinquish what he sees as his chance. He has always hated Donald Trump. They've been rivals of a sort for a while. Although Bloomberg is way above Trump on the billionaire list, they still have had a personal animosity for a number of years. And Bloomberg is intent upon showing up Trump once again. So that's part of his motive. And a lot of people like to talk about Bloomberg's plan or what he's going to do for America. There is no plan. Bloomberg's plan is that he wants to be president because it would satisfy his ego. That's it. That's the plan. Now, in terms of his plan to get elected, that's where the plan actually is. Bloomberg has already spent $350 million just on TV ads, and that number goes up every time it is mentioned. Just a week ago, it was only estimated around $250 million. That's not the only spending he's done, however. Bloomberg has also been flooding YouTube with ads. I imagine that, hell, before this video, there was probably a Bloomberg ad. I know sometimes when I check to see if my videos are running on my other account, a Bloomberg ad will come up on my stuff, and it's annoying every time. Anyhow, one thing that he's done to try to deprive other candidates of resources is that he has created a kind of non-PAC PAC where people pledge not to donate to super PACs for other candidates. So they're effectively donating to Bloomberg by not donating to his opponents. And there are some rich people who have signed up to do that. He also is literally just buying up people's campaign staff in what amounts to a 1980-style corporate takeover. Or like the war between WCW and WWF, where Ted Turner's company, WCW, was just offering people 5 times more money than what they were making under Vince McMahon. So what Bloomberg is doing is he is offering contracts paying double whatever they're making at the moment for whatever candidate they happen to be working for, and he's giving them guaranteed contracts until November. And that guarantee means that the contract continues to pay out regardless of what happens. Let's say Bloomberg is forced to drop out because of some massive scandal and he doesn't do anything else, and this happens tomorrow. The people under him will still get paid a good salary all the way to November for doing nothing. So a lot of people are signing up for that, as you might imagine, especially more centrist-leaning consultants. Even at least a few Bernie people have jumped ship to get the payday. So this is something that is buying up a lot of the talent pool. Now, I don't think that this will be a huge factor. Hillary Clinton in 2016 thought that by literally hiring all the consultants that she could prevent a strong primary challenge from emerging, because she thought that only people who had degrees from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale were capable of running a campaign. Of course, everybody in her campaign had degrees from one of those 3 places, and they were all complete and total morons. So she made a pretty big error there, and we'll get into more of her stupidity in a minute when we look at the electoral map. Anyhow, if we look at what Bloomberg is running for, he is a Republican who relabeled himself as a Democrat. The only difference between Bloomberg and a Republican is that he will give a little bit of lip service occasionally to wages, although as mayor he did veto a hike in the minimum wage, and he will sometimes also talk about the dignity of workers, but it's just empty rhetoric. The only issue where he's truly left, and this is not necessarily a good thing, is on the gun issue. On gun control, he is sort of in the Eric Swalwell camp of literally taking away guns. Not only that, but unlike some of the other candidates who are at least strong gun control advocates but are reasonable about it on some level, Bloomberg is outright contemptuous of people who would dare to own a gun, to the point where it's a kind of snobbery that would be very off-putting to a lot of independents. So for independents voting in the race, this would not be cool. And in a general election, this would be a huge turnoff to middle America. It's a literal middle finger from an uptight, elitist New Yorker. Other than the gun issue and not being homophobic, Michael Bloomberg is literally running for George W. Bush's 3rd term. George W. Bush was his political hero. He backed everything Bush did. He defended Bush's wars. And he gave a convention speech for W back in 2004. He also donated a shitload of money to Bush. He basically became a Democrat because he was running for politics in New York. And in New York, there's really only one party, at least one party that wins. So what we would see under a Bloomberg presidency, if he were to somehow get elected, is that he would undo the handful of things that Trump has done that are not in line with neoliberalism. He would probably further our commitments in the Middle East a little bit, and then undo the tariffs and other things that Trump has tried to do to promote American industry. So again, it would literally be Bush's third term, and I don't think that there's much appetite for that either in the Democratic primary field or in the general electorate. Here are three groups that Bloomberg will have a hell of a time winning in a primary. A majority of people of color. This is Mr. Stop and Frisk. No matter how many black pastors he gives money to say that what he did was okay because he apologized, I don't think that the majority of people of color will think that Mike Bloomberg is their guy. There also are some people who are ardently Democratic in the sense that their party identity is basically their religion, even though they don't really have an ideology to speak of. These are the blue no matter who people who get on Facebook and spend hours and hours ranting against anyone who would dare consider voting for either the Republicans or some sort of third party, as if it's like some sort of grand offense against the heavens. These people would not be happy with Bloomberg because his Democratic credentials are rather thin. Not only in terms of what he stands for, but in terms of his voting history. When he was mayor, he was an independent. He basically became a Democrat a few years ago because he hates Trump and because he wanted to work with the Democrats to fuck over Trump. That's literally why he's a Democrat. Another group is progressives. We progressives do not believe that billionaires should literally buy elections. We also don't agree with any of his policies. And we certainly don't want to go back to the era of George Bush. So, yeah, these are three major groups within the party who would not vote for him, and a whole lot of people, if he were nominated somehow, so if he got a plurality or there's a broker convention and he somehow wins, because he would demand to be the guy on the ballot if there is a broker convention. I can guarantee you that. You don't pour this kind of money and effort into a race to concede it to Pete the Cheat or to Amy Klobuchar. That is not going to happen. That is not an option. If Bloomberg goes into a broker convention, he will make sure that he gets his way or the highway. Because if they don't give him the nomination, he would threaten to run third party. And then spend billions of dollars to fuck over both parties as much as possible. My prediction for Bloomberg is that he has a high floor, but that his floor and his ceiling are basically the same thing. I don't think that he can get above maybe 20% to 25% max in the Democratic field. And the reason for that is because of all the shortcomings I've mentioned. Another thing that might yet happen is that people will look into how he got his money. One simply does not make $55 to $60 billion without engaging in actions that are deeply questionable. So whenever those reports start rolling in, Bloomberg will start taking hits. And the hits have already started coming in the form of that leaked audio. Bloomberg has a terrible track record on the issue of race. And of course, race is something that very much matters to the Democratic primary field. It's even possible if Bloomberg were nominated that Trump would present himself as the champion of people of color, and that he would do so in a way that was both unironic and semi-effective. Speaking of that, how would a Bloomberg versus Trump election look? I went to the website 270towin.com and I played around with the map in order to figure out what I think would be the result of a Bloomberg versus Trump election. It wouldn't quite be as bad as, say, 1972, but it wouldn't be much better. The country's become more polarized, and there are a lot of very blue safe states in the country. Outside of those very blue safe states, which I define as states that Hillary won by 10 or more points, usually 12 plus points, those are the only states I think Bloomberg would be able to carry. If you're looking at any of the soft blue states, those are gone. So Minnesota, she only won by about 1 point. There's no way in hell Mike Bloomberg was Minnesota. Minnesota has a union base. There's no way Bloomberg wins that. Iowa is winnable for a Democrat right now because Trump's approval rating is in the shitter in the state, but Bloomberg is not going to fix any of their problems. There's no way in hell that they go for him. Michigan, no way. Ohio, no way, because he has no economic message. One myth about the electorate right now is that Ohio is gone and that there's no way to win it. Complete bullshit. All you need is an economic message. In 2018, the year that supposedly proved that Ohio's unwinnable, Sherrod Brown won because he talked about unions and wages and things that people care about rather than just cultural issues. Take notes. Pennsylvania, no fucking way. Not even close. Bloomberg, with all of his anti-gun stuff, will turn off a lot of the centrist voters and the people in coal country in Pennsylvania. Wouldn't be close. Virginia, which Hillary won by about 5 points, would also go to Trump most likely. And again, it would be because Bloomberg offers nothing to the core constituencies of the Democratic Party. He would not mobilize voters there very well. And he would also very much motivate voters in the more conservative parts of the state to show up in droves. Now, Virginia is one where it could possibly tip to Bloomberg, but it would be a nail-biter. The other states are so blue on the East Coast that there's almost no way that Trump could win. On the West Coast, it's very similar. Washington and Oregon are massively Democratic because all their population is in the liberal cities of Portland and Seattle. There's no chance of an upset there, but it would be a lot closer than it should be. And California is another one where it would be way closer than it should be, but it would be like a 51-49 win for Bloomberg. Hawaii would be way out of reach. I think it was like 65% for Hillary the last election. So that would be down to about 55, but it would still be a pretty comfortable win. But as you can see, 182 electoral votes is not nearly enough to come anywhere close to the White House. So yeah, this is what a Bloomberg nomination would do. And as I mentioned before, a brokered convention would almost certainly result in a Bloomberg nomination. So your choice is very simple. It's either Bernie Sanders or a brokered convention which results in this. Due to the likelihood of a brokered convention, I would say that it is as likely as a Bernie majority at this point. Pretty 50-50. Other possibilities are low percentage. I guess it's not technically 50-50, but you get what I mean. These are the two most likely outcomes, either a brokered convention or Bernie wins outright. Brokered conventions are not a good place to be for a political party. A contested convention is one thing, it is recoverable, but a brokered convention is something that basically condemns your party to defeat, barring something even worse happening on the other side. So let's say that the brokered convention produces Bloomberg. A lot of people will feel cheated, the Democratic base will be deeply demoralized, independents will not be inspired, Bloomberg will have all the problems I talked about. The only chance he would have of winning at a brokered convention would be if the economy literally collapsed, or if Trump got another standoff with a country like Iran and then went to war and it ended up being a bloodbath and a lot of Americans got killed. Those are really pretty much the only two ways that Bloomberg could beat Trump. Now, we don't have brokered conventions very often. And also the primary process really only goes back to about the 19-teens. So it's only about 100 years old. There was one election, however, where both parties had brokered conventions, 1952. And a lot of people, when they talk about this election involving Bernie, will reference 1972, largely because they're trying to paint him with the brush of McGovern. I've talked about this in another video. I think an election people need to look more at is 1952. Both parties had a brokered convention, but although the Republicans in their convention nominated Eisenhower, he actually lost the primary race to Robert Taft, the son of the former president and an arch conservative from Ohio who is famous for Taft-Hartley. So Robert Taft was a true red conservative who wanted to totally destroy the New Deal. The Republicans at the convention decided that this would be disastrous electorally because they had already tried that campaign against Truman and gotten their asses handed to them in 1948. So they took the nomination from Taft and gave it to Eisenhower, who was a war hero and would be much more likely to win over, moderate Democrats and independents. Keep in mind too that when Eisenhower basically signed on to the New Deal, that the Republicans more or less were offering social conservatism without any real change in an economy that was growing and prospering already, and no cuts, or no major cuts at least, to the programs that were lifting people out of poverty. So basically what this did was create an economic consensus, and it effectively sealed the New Deal in for the next 20 or so years. So for the Republicans, the Worker Convention actually made sense in 1952 because they had an actual strategy, and they had a candidate they knew who would do better among voters who were not overwhelmingly conservative. For the Democrats, however, they fucked it up bad. Estes Keef Over was a senator from Tennessee. He was sort of center-left, maybe solidly left, certainly not left-wing. He was somewhat moderate, I guess you could say, on the issue of race, is what they called a racial moderate. However, among the racial moderates, he was one of the better ones. He was not explicitly in favor of racism, but at the same time, he was not exactly a civil rights champion. That being said, it was 1952, and the civil rights movement was not quite at maturity yet. Keef Over was somewhat of a national hero, or at least a celebrity, going into the 1952 cycle. He gained a lot of national attention by refusing to go along with Joseph McCarthy during the House of Un-American Activities hearings. He went along with an earlier play by Truman to hunt out communists, but then he refused to do it with McCarthy. Now, maybe he was just being a partisan Democrat with that, but at any rate, he was one of the few people who stood up and said something. That gained him some attention. Then he started investigating corrupt dealings in large cities, and he started going after mob bosses and having hearings revealing their dealings. The problem was that this also threatened to expose party bosses in the cities, including Democratic Party bosses who had a lot of dealings with organized crime. So Keef Over was seen as something of a threat to the party establishment. Truman fucking hated this guy because Truman was friends with all the establishment party bosses. So in the primary, they only had it in maybe 20 states. Keef Over basically kicked ass. He won almost all of the states, including a lot of the states that the Republicans could potentially win in a general. So going into the convention, it was obvious that Keef Over was their best bet, and that he was the guy who got their base fired up and who promised to extend the New Deal and also to root out corruption, something that voters of all stripes can get behind. This was something that would be exciting. It would correct some of the errors of the Democratic Party. Because even though the Democrats were very popular as a party, people still recognized there were issues. So Keef Over had a pretty good chance of winning. Even going up against the war hero Eisenhower, who was not a very skilled politician in 1952. He was mainly banking on his name recognition. Well, the Democrats decided instead to give the nomination to Adlai Stevenson. Now, Adlai Stevenson is beloved among historians today because he took the right stance on civil rights early. And good for him. It's good that he was on the right side of the issue. However, Adlai Stevenson got annihilated in 1952. Completely annihilated. Now, Keef Over would not have been the favorite in that race. Eisenhower, as a national hero, was going to be damn hard to beat. However, I think it's safe to say that Keef Over had a much better shot than Stevenson. So let's go back to 2020. Bernie has the most supporters who are not attached to the party. Bernie does well with independents. He's acceptable to almost the whole base. There's a lot of talk from the Warren campaign about how she's the only person who everybody likes. Well, they have about the same favorability and unfavorability ratings. Warren does very marginally better, but she also doesn't really have as many supporters, so that's kind of a problem. And if you look outside of the party, clearly Bernie has way more support. And he also doesn't piss off Republicans the same way that Warren does. Bernie also taps into a much maligned segment of the population. the people who vote for the third parties on the left. Every time the Democrats don't quite win, whether it's 2000 or 2016, establishment Democrats wag their fingers and wax poetic about how those goddamn lefties who won't just suck it up and vote blue no matter who cost us the election. Guess what? There is a candidate who can win over those voters. There's one candidate precisely who can win those voters. That little segment of the voting population that some people are so goddamn convinced is the key to winning everything, or at least the key to losing everything. So if you want to keep the Jill Stein voters in the Democratic Party, you have to go with Bernie Sanders. That's something that you need to tell your establishment friends. If you want to keep the Jill Stein people in line, Bernie Sanders is the answer. So that is my case for why our choice at this point is between Bernie Sanders and a brokered convention, that a brokered convention would result in Michael Bloomberg, and that Bloomberg is basically a guaranteed defeat. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.